today's webinar. Our topic for today, design thinking, top strategies for P2P success in the mid-market. We've got an exciting program for you today. And I just wanted to cover a couple of housekeeping tips before we get into the gist of our agenda for today. So firstly, you're on the WebEx platform. For most of you, audio will be provided through your computer speakers. In fact, for all of you, through your computer speakers only. However, if you have any difficulty hearing the program today, there's an opportunity for you to click on the phone icon to receive the teleconference information. As we go through the information contained in today's webinar, feel free to log in any questions you may have through the dial-out chat box, and we'll do our best to cover as many of your questions as we can at the conclusion of today's webinar. And finally, if you experience any technical problems during the webcast, please this email address, webcast@zycus.com, to troubleshoot any of those challenges. So first thing I have to do is introduce my co-presenters. First of all, my name is Richard Waugh. I'm Vice President Corporate Development at Zycus, and I'm flanked by two very knowledgeable experts in our field. Andrew Bartolini is the founder and Chief Research Officer, resource as well, but Research Officer at Ardent Partners. And Bob Cohen is the Research Director at Ardent Partners. And we'll all have a role to play in today's webcast. I'm very pleased to be joined by such often knowledgeable experts today. And just before I turn it over to Andrew, I'll tell you a little bit about Zycus. We're your host and sponsor for the webinar today. We are a provider of an integrated suite of the pay software tools. And we're focusing in particular on Procure-to-Pay, just as the title suggests, with design thinking for a successful blueprint for Procure-to-Pay. But don't look at Procure-to-Pay in a vacuum. It's part of this end-to-end approach to a source-to-pay suite of tools that spend analytics and e-sourcing, contract and supplier management, Procure-to-Pay, and the operational aspect of procurement. So you get both the upstream or strategic aspects of procurement as well as the operational, and sort of tying that all together for really to make sure that procurement gets credit for all the hard work that you do, which is financial savings management, a way to document that contributed to the business. And this has consistently been a leader, as acknowledged, for instance, here by Gartner for the Magic Quadrant. So one of only 3 leaders in the most current Magic Quadrant for suite vendors, and in fact consistently a leader in the last 3 iterations report. So without further ado, I told you about Zycus. I'll turn it over to Andrew to tell you a little bit more about Ardent Partners and what we have planned for you today. A technical glitch for a second, Andrew. I don't hear you.
Sorry about that. We have this weird reversion on the technical side with WebEx today. Apologies, everybody. So hello and good day, everybody. This is Andrew Bartolini. I'm the founder and Chief Research Officer at Ardent Partners. Now, my firm is a research and advisory firm that's focused on defining and advancing the supply management and operations strategies, processes, and technologies that drive business value and accelerate organizational transformation within the enterprise. Now, we produce 2 types of research to help business decision makers accomplish a few things, right? So the first type is helping organizations understand industry best practices and how to improve performance. And we also publish research that helps these leaders gain insights into the technology landscape and how to identify the best fit solutions for their specific budget and requirements. And so that research does also cover the mid-market. For those of you that enjoyed today's presentation, there's much more of that where that came from. If you can visit either of these 2 sites that are part of the Ardent Partners Network. CPA Rising, as you might expect, takes more of a procurement focus and really tackles the topics and that are important to CPOs and other procurement executives. Place is our other site, and it does take more of a focus on financial operations and automation, including including payments. And between the two, there's pretty consistent coverage of the entire business process as Richard was describing it, and P2P. As we're talking about it today. Those of you joining and listening in on the procurement side, we'd like to take this opportunity to invite those of you to at least consider attending our annual CPA Rising event, which will be held this November in Boston. This is a two-day conference where CPOs from around the globe come together to share best practices and network and really learn to understand what's on the cutting edge of the profession. So November 7th and 8th in Boston. So that brings us to the agenda. I've worked through the introduction with Richard, and what we're going to do now is I'm going to start by talking about the state of P2P, leveraging some of our most recent research, and what is the state of P2P in 2018 before passing it back over to Richard and Bob, and they're going to talk about the strategies that mid-market leaders and those of you beyond the mid-market can use to drive success across your P2P programs. And then we'll obviously be here for your questions. So, as you get them, feel free to type those in, and we'll answer them accordingly. So, this P2P in 2018, right? It's a very interesting time. I've been working in this industry for nearly 20 years, and both sides of the P2P, both procurement and AP, have really made significant strides forward in that period of time. Now, spend a fair amount of time talking about procurement. Procurement transformation, really has been something that has been very broad-based, cross industry, cross geography, cross company size. The impact of procurement today, there's a night and day difference between what procurement was doing by and large 20 years ago and what's happening today. Now, PA's transformation, has been no less significant within the department itself. However, I'd say it's still fair to say that the broad-reaching impact that we've seen from procurement, has yet to resonate within the AP part of this process. Now, there are a couple of drivers that I think are going to, begin to bridge the gap between the two organizations, right? I think that if we were all, and Richard and Bob were also, working in the industry at the time, and they can back me up. When we were originally talking about P2P, Procure-to-Pay, there honestly was no real contemplation of how to manage and handle the second P there, the AP component of that. And that's changed pretty significantly over the years, right? Organizations are thinking more holistically about the entirety of their source to settle or source to pay processes, as you may refer to them. There's unification between organizations and much stronger collaboration. And as a result, or maybe it's a byproduct actually, this collaboration of organizations being able to deliver unified closed-loop systems that can manage the entirety of the P2P process. So, that is sort of a little backdrop. Let's dive in and look at some of the research, what's happening in the world of P2P today. The research that I'm showing you, just so you understand, right? So we're taken from two studies done within the past 9 months. The first draws from about 350 respondents on the procurement side. The second, that has the more AP-focused data, had about 175 respondents. So very good representation of what's happening globally within procurement and what's happening locally as well. And when we look out at what CPOs are most focused on in 2018 and in 2019, it's a very different chart that I'm showing you here than if there had been, than the one I would have shown you about a decade ago, and I was doing this research back then too. Back then, it was savings and it was sort of tactical impact. Was hands down the CPO's top priority. Now, along the way and over the course of a decade of sort of progressive advancements within the organization, what procurement is focused on, or CPOs are focused on, is much more broad-based than in the past, right? And that's in part because procurement has become a more strategic business process. It's also in part because we're still in a pretty positive economic environment, right? Where approaching almost a decade from the Great Recession. And so, there's an element of that has savings, down towards the bottom of the list of priorities. But what CPOs are focusing on, both short-term and medium-term, are the things that will provide a sustainable, longer-term advantage, right? By focusing in and improving upon processes, and it can include automating them, of course. By getting the right people working on the right projects, significant impact as well. And what we've seen, more recently is really a drive for innovation, and that innovation from the procurement side can happen within the organization, right? Are there new ways of thinking about your category management strategies? But there's also innovation that's happening at a much faster pace, or at least seemingly a much faster pace outside the organization. And procurement really is charged and meant with finding that innovation within the supply chain, within the supply markets, bringing that back into the organization, and then transforming that out again to its customers. Real challenges for the CPO and for procurement organizations, right? Staff and talent, is really, I think, for the first year in about a decade that it was not procurement's top challenge, right? CPOs often decry the fact that they're struggling for headcount, as they're tasked with taking on more responsibilities, as they're tasked with placing more spend under management, as purview of their operations continues to expand and get more complex based upon globalization and a variety of other factors. They're not given, headcount increases that are commensurate with the expansion of responsibilities. And so one of the CEO's top challenges remains headcount. But the other challenge, and this is one that I think at least the best-in-class CPOs are beginning to address in a much more proactive manner, is even if I think every business unit within the enterprise today is really challenged with doing more with less, right? That's just the standard operating procedure. But procurement also has a challenge in getting the right talent into the organization and retaining that talent and training it. And best-in-class CPOs have started to become much more proactive, and how they're thinking about bringing that talent into the organization, how they're upskilling it, and how they're retaining it. The other challenge, right? So procurement's not alone in the staffing challenges, of course, but procurement still is not at the head of the line when it comes to budget allocations, and so top challenges there continue for CPOs. From a procurement master, so in procurement, I'd say organizational mastery really does remain an ideal for most, right? It's a target. How do we as an organization do things efficiently? How do we do things that are effectively? And how do we really begin to deliver the game-changing value in a consistent way? When to describe the keys to departmental mastery, CPOs did agility as the most important element, right? So I've personally been writing about procurement agility for 7 years now, and I think that agility sort of is understood as a very clear goal. It's given the volatility that we see in markets, and it's not necessarily volatility up and down in a consistent fashion. It's really the speed of business that's changed, right? The level of innovation that's changed. Organizations and enterprises, right, and your organizational leadership, for those of you listening in, right, they're no longer thinking about 10 and 15-year plans, right? They're thinking about how do we execute, this game plan over the next 18 months, and even if it's a 3 plan, what are those checkpoints to make sure that the targets we're going after, are consistently, remain the same over that short period of time. So agility, really a top priority. Now, think quickly here over to the AP side of the house, right? So, AP, right, so mentioned, right, has become significantly, more strategic in its orientation and in its approach and in its impact. One of the drivers of that has been the strong partnership with procurement that we've started to see emerge really more recently. Really, it's only been over the past 5 or 6 years that this partnership has started to take hold. And so we're now at a point where, yes, being efficient, lowering the cost of processing invoices and do it in a timely fashion become very, very important. But there's a view here by a slight majority of AP organizations that working better with the partners in procurement, and starting to see work better with partners in treasury, really start to unlock a lot of value for the AP organizations. Areas currently managed or supported by AP, right? So, again, here are some of the opportunities for those of you listening in on the AP side of the house to become more strategic, to have a larger impact on operations, to have a larger impact on results. And P2P, right, I think is sort of the unifying theme today, and Bob and Rich are going to talk in a few minutes about, how not only do you need to select the right technology, but how do you organize and design a program that's built for success, not only for the short term, but for the long term. But as you start to go down the list here, you start to see things that really are much more strategic, right? So providing visibility and intelligence to key stakeholders, and sort of marry that to the impact that AP, the potential impact that most AP organizations have on cash management. We're operating in a pretty loose credit environment today, so it's not as large of a concern for most organizations at the large enterprise level. But at the mid-market, cash is still king, and AP's ability to provide visibility and intelligence and guidance and impact, cash positions, through partnership with Treasury, or if you don't have a treasurer, with your CFO, remains an extraordinary opportunity at the mid-market level and all the way up market as well. Along the lines of procurement mastery and what happens there, right? So the essential elements for AP success, really does start with systems that drive efficiencies. I'd say that when we look at the defining characteristic of best-in-class AP organizations over the past decade, it's been the ability to drive process standardization and general efficiencies across the entire operation. But those objectives and those goals, continue to grow and expand, and we see these factors as being critical elements for AP success in the future. And we see that's Ardent. I mean, this is what the market is telling us, right? The opportunity to become much smarter about the information that's being captured and making better decisions as a result of that. It's really powerful, and that's something that exists on both sides of the P2P landscape. Now, one of procurement's broad-based transformation has been the introduction of supply management technologies, right? The Procure-to-Pay solutions that was referring to, earlier, really have been, a foundation upon which many best-in-class procurement organizations have been built. But what you see here and what I'm showing you is the percentage of enterprises that have adopted each of these specific applications, as indicated by the blue, versus the gray, which shows the interest in the next 2-3 years in adopting those solutions. And so the big picture view here is that a fully automated source-to-settle process, or even fully automated P2P process, remains the exception and not the rule. But there has been momentum on that, right? Our firm, takes hundreds of inquiries each year, and more and more of those that are coming in are thinking about their investments in technology in a much more holistic way, looking at multiple applications or suites as part of that. Now, I'm going to just close out with just a view on the AP side of some of the things that the leaders are able to do and able to do well, right? The best in class, right? These would be the top 20% of performers in any Ardent Partners study. And what we see, here is that, the leaders on the AP side are able to do most things, pretty well or pretty significantly, right? I mean, even the best in class on the AP side have a way to go to, really becoming masters, as it were. But you look at things as standard, right? Do you have standard processes? What matching capabilities? The need to touch every invoice that comes in, or do you have straight-through processing capabilities? Here, hopefully, the takeaway for those of you listening today is that the best in class are still some work to do, but significantly superior as it relates to the rest of the organizations, the other 80%. And when we look at and we begin to try to understand, well, what are the drivers of best-in-class performance? Variety of factors, but one thing that really does hold true is I show you the solutions as adopted by the best-in-class, as seen in blue, versus the all others, the other 80%. We see that best-in-class organizations not only have adopted solutions to a greater degree, at points somewhere between being more than I think almost 60% more likely to adopt solutions. They're also better users of the solutions, right? They focus on end user adoption. They focus on improving and codifying their best practices and sharing those. And sort of lit here on the technology point, I think it's a very interesting time for those in the mid-market, because the mid-market really has been opened up to an ability to access a lot of the solutions that you see on this chart here. But what I'm going to do now is introduce you to Bob and Richard, and they're going to walk you through these top strategies. So, Bob, over to you.
Andrew, nice job. Covered a lot of material there. Hope that everyone a good understanding, a little bit of what the market looks like today. And as Andrew said, it's based on research that we've had, so it's good to validate where you stand whenever you're starting a project. So I thought we'd begin by defining the market and what we mean by this, because I've got people out there, and depending on who you ask, you might get a different answer on what the mid-market means to them. So I thought I'd ask Richard, started off by asking Richard, what does the mid-market mean to you?
Well, yes, and I would say, Bob, sort of a generally accepted definition tends to focus on revenue size as maybe the most reliable denominator of the mid-market. And in our case, and I think in many cases, it tends to be those companies at $1 billion in revenues and below, with some caveats and exceptions, that include in that one case where revenue may not be a reliable burden at all is companies in the biotech field that could even be pre-revenue. Unicorns out there that have minimal or perhaps non-existent revenues, but are bringing a new drug to market, for example, so their market capitalization is already perhaps over $1 billion even without their revenue metric. And of course, sometimes you could look at other metrics such as employee headcount, those kinds of things. But I think in general, we're talking about those companies, many of which are growing very rapidly, but just at the present time, revenues are somewhere below $1 billion on an annual basis.
Richard, what you alluded to there is really important, but certain characteristics of a company that's moving from an organization has gone into that mid-market state, and that's really a better way of defining what the mid-market looks like, as you talked about. So now that we've kind of found out what the mid-market looks like, let's take a look at some challenges that mid-market organizations are facing today. First off, too much paper. You can see the slide in front of us here. There's a gentleman who's paper up in there. He's just had enough. You're drowning in paper. What before you're able to manage the purchase orders in paper, the invoices in paper, that no longer flies anymore. You've scaled up, it just becomes untenable. Excel is a great tool, but it can't do everything. It has limits. It's not a production procurement system, invoice management tracking system. It has its applications, but you're in its boundaries within that. Another challenge is that the existing solutions that you have in place are done for yesterday's business and yesterday's challenges, and they're also being pushed to their limits. So what you needed 5 years ago or 10 years ago when you were just starting out or the organization looked different are not solving today's problems. The big issue with organizations that we talk to, and I know Richard and I have discussed this in the past, is one of the big things is that people say have something in place, but it's not working for them because it's not designed for today and definitely not designed for tomorrow. The system in place, challenges, not user-friendly. People come on board, we're all faced with millennials joining the workforce. They're used to a different look and feel for an application. They're going to accept what we might have accepted 10 years ago, 15 years ago, as far as what we called a quote-unquote user-friendly interface. So we need to work on that. That's a big challenge that we have there. And also, as Andrew alluded to, these solutions were not designed holistically. They were designed kind of in a vacuum, a very siloed approach. And that's something that does not benefit the organization now. If we're going to help these mid-market organizations grow, we need to tackle this challenge of looking at everything holistically. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the slides down the road. Now, Richard, if you would talk a little about some specific challenges on the procurement side of the fence.
Yeah, I think you set it up really well. I just wanted to drill down a little bit more on what we're hearing from many of those mid-market customers about their specific and somewhat unique challenges. Not enough FTEs, full-time equivalents, just not enough headcount. So going back actually to the content that Andrew presented at the outset, he identified that budget and staffing constraints are the top challenges, not just for mid-market companies, but really across the board. Nobody has enough resources. In a few cases, are CPOs getting incremental headcounts added to their budget. And my point would be that while this is sort of universally true across the board, the challenge is even more acute for a mid-market company, which being smaller doesn't have the headcount to begin with and certainly doesn't have the level of specialization that a larger enterprise might. So if you're in procurement in a mid-market organization, you're probably trying to balance multiple tasks. You're doing those tactical transactional activities, processing requisitions and POs. At the same time, you're being asked to be strategically, managing categories and supplier relationships and those kinds of things. And that's where this balance between how you get allocated to strategic versus tactical activities becomes even more acute for the mid-market. So I'll call your attention to the infographic on here that comes from CAP's research that looked across industries. What is the relative proportionality of strategic resources, those folks in the organization, on things like category management, support management versus the transactional tactical activities? And there's certainly some variability from industry to industry, but across the board, the situation is probably the reverse of what most organizations would aspire to, in that there's the majority of resources, 62% currently allocated to tactical versus strategic. And again, I think in most cases the goal would how do we invert that such that actually allocating the majority of resources to strategic versus. And often in the transactional procure-to-pay process is the most critical enabler to be able to change this equation to make it more equitable and balance between strategic and tactical activities. So mid-market companies, as we said earlier, are also typically very high-growth organizations. So oftentimes for those organizations, growth trumps control. So even more so in a mid-market organization than a large enterprise, they experience rampant maverick spend because it's more important to get what I need right now rather than necessarily going through the rigor of strategic sourcing processes and making sure I'm getting the best total value on that spend. So lots of end users feel, in fact, empowered to do their own thing, and that certainly leads to the incidence of maverick spend. When we look at the system infrastructure, many of these are very antiquated systems. So legacy, from that millennial-proof kind of intuitive user interface that you were just talking about, Bob, to where may be dealing with the proverbial green screen kind of a interface from a legacy or ERP system that's not purpose-built for procurement. And that those systems don't provide the kind of process and spend visibility required for the typical mid-market procurement organization to be managing their spend strategically. And the challenge, having those antiquated or legacy systems in place, is for the organizations historically, the potential of a best-of-breed solution has simply been cost-prohibitive and been out of reach. And I think that is one of the most positive developments in this area, certainly owing in large part to the advent of cloud computing to make systems more accessible and more affordable to market as well as large enterprises. Certainly part of that equation has to be the ability to deploy a solution, a best-of-breed or cloud-based solution with limited or no IT support, because mid-market organizations find resources available from an IT standpoint. And they do all this very quickly. So a mid-market organization that's in a high growth mode or hyper growth mode, very aggressive savings targets because of the growth, they may find a rapid proliferation of the supply base. Whether that growth is organic or inorganic, and many of these organizations are growing through M&A, so overnight they can acquire a whole set of systems and processes and, yes, suppliers as well that need to be, regionalized and consolidated. So quite a laundry list, almost a perfect storm, challenges for the mid-market. But again, the good news is a lot of these technologies are now much more accessible to a market company just as well as a large enterprise to be able to really address this equation of how do I automate more of the tactical activities so I can become more strategic.
Great. So people think challenges are bad. Personally, I think they're good. The reason why is because the challenge presents an opportunity. If you're a glass half full kind of person, then you see these challenges as opportunities to improve and to make your mark in the organization. So with all these challenges Richard went into and the one I covered, the good is there's a lot of opportunity for improvement here. Cloud. 10 years ago, the cloud was really non-existent. It's everything we do is all cloud-based, SaaS-based type application. Applications are much more usable today. We talked about the millennials, and they're not going to put up with green applications, the older technology, difficult to use. We're talking about the consumerization of technology, and that applies not only to the consumer side of the fence, but also to the business side of the fence. You hear about it every single day. Why my app on my iPhone or Android so easy to use, and then I go to work and it's difficult? That shouldn't be the case. And solution providers have jumped on that bandwagon, and the applications they're developing today are much easier to use. Also, we touched on this too. Previously, P2P were out of reach. The price wasn't competitive. I know personally from my own background, when we first introduced a SaaS product, the pricing was ludicrous because we asked everyone to kind of bring up their own server, made them pay for that. Today, we've gotten past that. We're using cloud services that economically disperse the cost, and it's much more viable for people to get into a SaaS application much easier than it was ever in the past, and I think you're finding that it's even getting better as we go on here today. Payments are an area where communities exist. There's a huge opportunity for how we handle our cash. We've got procurement and AP, but the C is payables, and that includes payment. So we need to talk about how do we maximize our cash flow within our organization? How do we leverage how we're handling those purchase orders that come in, when we're approving them, when they're ready for payment, and then how do we work with our suppliers to provide them with the liquidity that they need, as well as provide the organization with the best return on its cash. All these things are huge opportunities that are presented by the technology advancements that we've seen over time here. So we've talked a little about the challenges. We've talked a little about the opportunities. Now we're going to get into what this webinar will at is some strategies for enhanced P2P success. So first and foremost, let's talk about thinking holistically. Andrew mentioned it. Richard mentioned it. And holistically, term that's often overused today, but really what it means is to look at the whole or complete system rather than just analyzing a part of the process. And when you're looking at the P process, there's really two things you need to look at holistically. The first one is your P process we talked about: sourcing, spend analysis, procurement, invoice automation, payment. You need to look at that in its entirety. But within that holistic view of P2P, you need to look at it within your organization. And there you have the people as well as the process that's going on here. So you need to take a look at holistic entity here. First is the P2P process, and then how does that P2P process fit within the organization? Richard, I know that Zycus has recently introduced something called Zycus, which was designed holistically to approach the mid-market. Can you talk about this a little for our listeners today?
Yeah, I'd like to share a little bit of the thinking, the design thinking, back to our topic behind what we've called Zycus Genesis. So Genesis, of course, is a beginning, a starting point, and important, I think, that, you know, as I mentioned at the outset of Zycus, for instance, we have an entire source-to-pay suite of tools. Particularly when we've engaged with mid-market organizations, it may be very difficult for them to be able to assimilate that entire set of tools and the level of change management and transformation that entails in one fell swoop. You know, you've got to start somewhere. You've got to walk before you run. And for metaphor, cliche you'd want to apply here. And our thought was that, you know, we wanted to boil down to the essence. What is the starting point to start to, you know, take a first step towards automating the transactional procurement so that in my next phase of transformation I can free up those resources and become more strategic as well. So that first step really starts, of course, with Procure-to-Pay is the bedrock, the foundational component, holistic view of Procure-to-Pay. So the P in the process, the purchasing transaction, starting with a requisition and automated approval workflow process to route that request for approval so that you know that the PO that goes up the door is compliant, that it's digital. So you're taking the friction and the paper out of the process, and not just on the front end either. Once you've placed that order and now the invoice shows up and I receive, again, PO, to be able to do that straight-through automated invoice matching process that Andrew highlighted for us as a best practice for the best-in-class organization. So really looking at P holistically, and just as importantly, in the Genesis model, let's call it P2P plus, because included here are those contiguous technology applications that really facilitate this whole process. So, for example, most organizations, when it comes to Procure-to-Pay, are trying to maximize the amount of spend that they get through on electronic catalogs, because after all, that's the most efficient buy pay process you can imagine. If a user can come in and search and point and click from an electronic catalog, put that in their shopping cart, place the order out the door, that very seamless, frictionless process. The challenge is many organizations, the majority of their spend would be for non-catalogable items, especially services spend. So here, if I don't have a catalog, I have to I've got a contract there, visible at the point of requisition, really for those non-catalogable transactions like services or non-standard products, such that I can do the compliance at critical point of requisition by having contract visibility built into that process flow. And part and parcel of an effective Procure-to-Pay deployment is making sure that you can efficiently onboard and enable suppliers to become transactional with you. So the other component here that's included in this first step of the process, this Genesis, is supplier information management to effectively onboard and enable the supply base. So now I can digitize all these key steps from onboarding to making the contracts visible, uploading hosted or punch-out catalogs, being able to manage the entire process flow, and just importantly, being able to complete the implementation in a very rapid process. So one of the other differentiators between a mid-market organization, larger enterprise perhaps, is, you know, a larger enterprise is more complex from an organizational standpoint. They make a much longer-term view of a rollout that may extend many months or even years in the process. That luxury simply doesn't exist for many mid-market organizations. So how do I distill this down such that it's an 8 to 12-week implementation? I can complete not only the rollout of the tools, but also the back-end integration into my ERP process in a very timely and effective manner. So that's sort of the print of of a solution geared specifically for those challenges faced by mid-market organizations. And next, I'll just sort of distill for you the core value proposition. It's how do I, as a high-growth mid-market organization, access a really a turnkey solution to complete this transformation of the transactional aspect of my procurement in a timely fashion and not have to sacrifice or make concessions in the process. So a mid-market organization, we think, with this type of a value proposition, has access to a best-in-class, just as any larger enterprise might. And Zycus certainly were recognized as a leader by Gartner and Forrester, and we address that challenge of user experience, which is going to be so critical to ensure adoption, which is the prerequisite to getting the results. So, for instance, I'll talk in a minute about what that means in terms of a guided buying experience that's going to drive a rapid adoption. And rapid adoption has to go hand in glove with a rapid implementation. So how do I get a fully operational production instance of P2P in an 8 to 12 week cycle? I'll have to make it. I'm not dealing with a completely clean sheet of paper. I'm not reinventing the wheel. So wherever possible, I want to be able to leverage out-of-the-box best practices, such workflows, templates, and expert resources to help me do that. And I need to be able to do it with a minimal involvement because I simply don't have those resources at my disposal. So certainly being able to lean on the solution provider to not deliver the technology through the cloud, but also support the buyer outreach and onboarding efforts. And lastly, the value proposition has to mean that this is both easy to buy and easy to own. So in the case of Genesis, this takes both the software and the implementation, rolls those together in a fixed annual cost that's predictable, easy to budget for, and we think very affordable, and supported by a strong return on investment and value equation. So to net it out, for about what it would cost, most organizations for a full-time equivalent employee with comp and benefits and overhead, you get less transactional procurement capability in less than 90 days.
Great. I think you bring up one really important point, is when looking for a solution, you rely on the vendors that you're talking to. They have more experience implementing and talking to companies on through similar things to what you company are looking for. So use them as a resource. You touched on that, and I don't know that companies do that often. Is look to the vendors as subject matter experts, because there's very few organizations out there that have done 100 implementations like Zycus has in the space. So learned a lot all along the way. They learned what to do, they learned what not to do. So I encourage anybody listening to definitely leverage the experience from vendors building out the process here. So let's look at the second strategy that we suggest here, which is defining your goals, objectives, and success. We've all heard the old saying, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. Well, when your C project, especially one as important as a P2P implementation, it's critical that you identify the goals, the objectives, and what success looks like. Speaking with a listener this week, and she was looking at a P2P solution, and they were looking at what the solution could do today to solve today's problems. She didn't consider tomorrow and what they need down the road. They're only looking to solve their pain and problems today. That is a huge mistake. You need to make any solution that you take a look at is not only solving today's issues, it's also taking a look at tomorrow's issues as well. You put together some specific areas that people should look at when setting their goals and objectives. Why don't we take a look at those?
Yeah, Bob, and I think for each organization to define and prioritize which of this is a representative sampling of goals and objectives, but which ones matter to me, and what are the success metrics that are going to tell me if I'm achieving that goal along the way. So in this model, sort of positioned right here in the center of the bullseye is sort of the hard dollar saving component of the P2P value proposition, which is if I can reduce maverick spending, bring more spending into client with preferred negotiated contracts, I'm going to drive a hard dollar savings to the bottom line, and organizations are focused on that. But as Andrew mentioned earlier, savings has become less of a top priority, and recognizing that all of these goals are mutually exclusive. You can pursue many combinations. It's important to note that for organizations, savings, at least in the current environment, may not be the predominant goal. In that case, it may be, I mentioned earlier, if I happen to be a pre-IPO biotech company, or maybe I've just gone IPO, savings may not be at the top of my list, because for me, it's all about regulatory compliance, ensuring process and regulatory compliance. Precursor to that IPO event, and making sure that I don't run afoul of the regulator. So many of these sort of goal and objectives may be part of your model, but it's really important to identify which ones matter the most to me and what strategy I want to pursue. So we talked about the A side of the equation as well, and that's important to understand. What is my working capital goal, for example? So it may be that I want to, to accelerate my overall invoice approval and processing cycle time such that I can take advantage of or maximize early pay discounts. On the other hand, an organization may really want to be able to hold on to working capital as long as possible. So in that case, I don't want to capture early pay discounts, but I want the visibility that digitizing the end-to-end P2P process can provide, such that I can actively pursue a strategy of maximizing days payable outstanding on to capital as long as possible. So I'm really different objectives, process efficiency, that's all part and parcel of enough time to spend less time on those tactical pursuits. I want to reinvest that productivity dividend such that I can allocate more of my staff to strategic activities. Or, I'm really focused on budget control, which gets into not just spend management, but demand management, being able to, defer or deny expenditures that are ex-budget before they even happen. So the different objectives, and then I think it's important to identify which ones are the most priority that you're looking for, and then defining what those success metrics are, so that as you go through this process, track your progress towards success as you go forward. So, Bob, just a couple thoughts in that area as well.
Yeah, great, thank you. I think the second strategy leads us very well into the third strategy here, which is making sure you engage users early in the process. History littered with projects that were well-intentioned but were never adopted by users and failed miserably. The lesson to be learned here is you need to engage users early and often in the process. We talk setting goals. There's the goals that you have as a procurement organization, as a P2P organization, as a finance organization, whatever it may be. But for your goals, you need to understand what the goals of the businesses are, the business units, and what the goals of the end users are, and make sure that whatever plan you put in place takes into account both of those. That's one sure way to increase your chances of success. I think, Richard, you have a really good example of how to get users in process early on. Why don't you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, for a moment, I'd like all the procurement professionals, our audience, put yourself in the shoes of your end users just for a second, and I want to focus on user experience. And I would differentiate between user experience, UX, if you will, and UI, user interface. So we all think about user interface being synonymous with user experience, but user interface is that cosmetic layer. And we all know beauty is only skin deep, but it's more than just having nice colors and big buttons and those kinds of things. real user experience is, can I effectively, as an end user, complete what I need to do very quickly and easily, and frankly get back to my day job, which really has to take precedence over this. And putting yourself in the shoes of your end users, trained procurement people, you make it easy for them to do the right thing, which is to make a compliant purchase. And I think that really starts the moment of truth, if you will, with any end user experiences. When I log into that Procure-to-Pay portal, I quickly and easily find what I need and check out so that I can get back to my real work. Because if I don't, odds are I may not come back. I may be tempted to become that maverick buyer, that rogue buyer who circumvents the process altogether. So just walking you through this, I'm going to go on guided buying, a model here that utilizes artificial intelligence to simplify and streamline the process for the end user. And it starts with that search. As I said, the moment of truth. I log in. End user, in this example, for instance, for a screwdriver, I don't need to know that the proper categorization of that may be a power tool or a hand tool. I'm looking for a screwdriver, and here the intelligence needs to be built into the system that says how I think about that product or service, my natural language search term. The system can, on the fly, using artificial intelligence, take those clues in search term and present to me the proper categories, and not only category, but also through contracted vendors for that category that I'm trying to purchase. So really drive a compliant purchase, also make it easy for me to get to the right answer very quickly. And finally, when it comes time to check out, streamline that process for me as well. So one of the biggest frustrations for end users historically with P2P systems is having to add a 50-digit GL string and make a random guess at what the proper category is, or having to key in data about my ship to or bill to address. So one of the things that AI can do me in this guided buying process is default all that information. So based on what I'm buying, who I am in the organization in terms of what my permissions are, maybe dollar threshold, the appropriate category-specific approval workflow, default all of my bill to, ship to information, map from the system assigned, AI-generated category code to the GL code, such that all of that information is populated for me and give me the visibility out to see what is the approval path my requisition is going to follow, and then give me status information along the way so I'm not kept in the dark. So that really, in a nutshell, is a way to focus on what is that user experience to make sure that my end users will be inclined to adopt the tool because it's going to remove the guesswork and the friction in the process. So just an illustration there for you, Bob.
Example, Richard. I mean, you need to make it easy for end users. You want them to go on the system they need to and move on to whatever their real job is. So the real job is buying things, unless you're in the procurement department. For all the end users out there, the guy looking for the screwdriver, for the printer, for the computer, for the paper, whatever it may be, they just get that done as quickly and easily as possible. Guided buying is a great example of how we bring the end user's needs and wants into the whole process here. So let's take a look at the fourth strategy here that we have. Collaboration is king. You got to give to get. This is talking about creating a win-win situation. We need to make sure that everyone can't get everything they want. We need to make sure that we are working with all the departments so that everyone comes out satisfied out of the whole process. So we take a look at the P2P process, and we need to understand, what's important to one group and another group, and how do we try to address as many situations and requirements and objectives as possible to create that situation where it's a win-win. I think, Richard, on the side, you have an excellent example of a customer you worked with and how you were able to create a win-win situation that ultimately benefited the organization. Why don't we take a look at that?
In this case, the give to get is really to make sure, and I'll just go through this case study quickly, but in the insurance company that really focused on both P's, so that holistic view. And the give to get means make sure there's something in it both for procurement and AP. And the before picture was struggling with manual process, sort of leveraging what limited capabilities were available in the incumbent ERP platform, but not having a single source of truth or an automated workflow around the full P2P, so if you will, and in this case deployed P2P along with the supplier portal, effectively onboard suppliers to make them transactional in the P2P platform. It took a pretty surgical approach to doing that. First of all, started with a strong message to the suppliers that this would be mandatory. So a little bit of the stick, but the carrot being lots of support all the way in terms of outreach through webinars and so on to make the suppliers comfortable, and then prioritizing those suppliers, let's say the 20% that account for 80% of the transaction volumes, and getting them up and running. And in deploying a P2P system, make sure that there's critical mass there for end users. So getting, some 40 catalogs and a full library of configured guided forms for the non-catalog requisitions. At the end of the day, the story is both and procurement benefited. Being decentralized the purchasing process and implement a no PO, no pay policy along the way, and some of the resulting benefits are pretty compelling. By enabling more of a self-registration process through the supplier portal, reduce vendor management FTE support costs on the order of 87%. Automating that three-way invoice matching, say 40% of time in AP, shortening cycle times to drive early discount savings from not just compliance, but also eliminating duplicate payments as well. So having something in the mix for both procurement and AP, a critical success factor here.
Great point. Like we said up front, you think holistically about animals, and this is a great example of that. So now let's take a look at the strategy we have here, which is seek CFO sponsorship or executive sponsorship. A critical part of any project, especially one as important and as wide-ranging and impacting as a procure-to-pay project, you need to make sure you have that executive sponsorship. I talked about this, and we've seen way too many projects fail over the years because no executive sponsorship was attached to the project. Someone signed off on it but really wasn't bought into it, and then when things happened, people pushed back. There were sorts of problems, and the project ultimately was not as successful as it should have been. So when you're getting CFO sponsorship, some suggestions are talk to the CFO in language that they understand. They don't want to talk about procurement. They don't want to talk about AP metrics. They don't care about how long it takes to process an invoice, the time from receipt of a purchase order or a requisition to the time the product is shipped. Those are all important to the organization, don't get me wrong. But that CFO wants to understand how this is going to make the organization more profitable, more financially viable. Talk to them in terms that they speak on a regular basis. Talk to them about the metrics that are in their scorecards. Talk to them about EBITDA, profitability, compliance insurance, growing the business, and help to fund for the expansion of the business. Talk to them in this language, and you've got their attention. You've got that seat at the table, and then you can go into how you build a business case for this to talk to them. Here's how here's what we're going to do to help you achieve your metrics, and we're going to build a business case to show you how we're going to do that. And we should put together a case that they have here where they built a business case for achieving P2P success to help get that CFO sponsorship. So, Richard, why don't you take us through that for a minute or two?
Yeah, absolutely, Bob. And just as you say, you got to express it in the language of the CFO, and the lingua franca of CFO is dollars and cents, right? So lots of detail. I won't go through it, but I think the key is putting together a compelling business case that's sufficiently conservative that the CFO is going to sign off that this is achievable, but yet compelling enough that it's going to be material into the impact. So here, just a typical, say, mid-market organization that may have about $100 million in spend, where each marginal improvement around compliance, maybe about a third more of that spend being brought into compliance on contract, every dollar that's from a Maverick purchase into a compliant purchase results in about 8% savings. So definitely the big driver of the business case, but also after seeing that argument with the other ancillary benefits around process efficiency in terms of reducing the PO and invoice processing costs, maximizing the early pay discounts. So even conservative case like this could result in nearly about 3% savings, so almost $3 million for $100 million in spend. So the results may vary, could be much more, could be slightly less, but I think in most cases what we've seen is the opportunities are so significant that you can distill it down to a very compelling argument that the CFO is going to get behind and green light your project.
The 3% in savings that you mentioned, that goes straight to the bottom line. That helps organizations improve their EBITDA. That improves their profitability. You would have to sell, depending on your business, in order to $3 million in profits, you might have to sell $10, $20 million, depending what your profit margin is, your cost of goods sold. So when you show that 3% savings, that's straight to the bottom line, and that's how you talk to the CFO. Great point there. So we're in the home stretch here, and the sixth and final strategy we have here is about designing for success. This is Ardent's P2P blueprint. Ultimately, the enterprises that are able to craft the right P2P blueprint and build the foundation into the likelihood of success, the speed of implementation, and when you and your team is developing your blueprint, it's important to consider all the following items that we've listed here. The list is not meant to be exhaustive, although if you're looking at it, may think it is. We've listed things that we found most critical in designing a blueprint here, and we've covered a number of them in this presentation, and it's just kind of a good recap when you look at designing your strategy and making sure that you put everything in place for success, that you kind of cover each of these as fully as possible. So let's go quickly to the summary here, be cognizant of our time here. You know, in short, there's really no excuse for a P2P operation to be siloed and operating around the fringes of the business. You need to be engaged with all parts of the business. We've learned that if you don't do this, the chances for success are greatly diminished. It's incumbent upon executives, procurement, and AD to take a lead role in driving this transformation. It's that you're at the forefront, you're talking to the businesses, and you're the one that's making the change. There's that saying that says, you know, be the change that you be. That was full force here when talking about the PD transformation, especially in the mid-market, where organizations are no longer the small, we can get it on a manual basis and get by. You've moved past that, and now you have growth challenges. You're breaking at the seams, hopefully there. What worked before doesn't work anymore. So the P2P executives really need to be the ones that are in charge on this. So in summary, just about the 6 goals that we have here. Think big picture, set objectives that work today and P2P, but the entire business and also in the future. And stakeholders early, make sure that they thought in the process. The more you do this, the better chance you have for success of delivering a system that's going to be valuable to the organization and that people are going to want to use. Make that you create a win-win situation when dealing with all these different groups, not ramming something down anyone's throat, just making sure that everyone's out feeling good about the entire process and what they're getting, and they can use these tools and they can make an impact with it. Number we talked about just recently is make sure you get executive sponsorship. It's critical. And then finally, make sure you have that blueprint so you know where you're going and your steps covered. And if you don't, that's the process. in short, we've laid here, Andrew talked about what's going on in the industry. Richard and I tried to use some of our experience when working with companies in the mid-market that have grown out of the small little organizations and now are bursting at the seams and growing and have different sets of challenges. And we tried to lay out some of the experiences that we encountered over the years and some of the best practices. So hopefully you'll find this worthwhile and can leverage some of the material that we provided to you. I think at this point I'm going to bring back on Andrew and Richard. We're going to take any questions that you may have. If you've not asked a question yet, and we do have a number of questions here, please use the Q&A function within WebEx, and we'll try to get to all the questions as best as possible.
Well, that's great, Bob, and Richard here, and I think we have time to get to all the questions, but maybe sort of if I can paraphrase some of the different questions that we've gotten here, they sort of all boil down to, I think all this information has resonated with our audience, but it kind of boils down to what is the single most important thing I should think about? How should I start to address these challenges in P2P in an organization like mine, in the mid-market? So, I'd ask Andrew, you and Bob just to share as a final thought and that kind of question. If I had to do one thing, where should I start? How should I go about this?
I'll start. I think that again, it's having the blueprint, right? So it's thinking about not just what you have for your current budget, but what's the overall goal and sort of longer term vision, so that what you start building tomorrow builds towards that, right? So you have to have the whole process in mind from the start, if your budget is only enough to get you partially down the road.
Yeah, I would.
You as well, Bob.
Along the similar lines is, understand what success looks like. We got athletes visualizing, winning games and how they're going to play, and I think we need to conduct ourselves in a similar fashion when we're looking at a P2P process here. What does success look like? And visualize how end users and your constituents and the business units are going to leverage that technology. So I think that's a really important step. Obviously, you need the blueprint, but then take a look at, 8 to 12 weeks, 6 months, whatever the time frame is for implementation of the full P2P system. You visualize, what does that business unit experience look like, that user there? What does that AP person experience look like? And try to visualize those things and say, if I'm getting what I need, I can make strategic decisions. If I'm on the procurement side, I'm getting great relationships with my clients. I'm getting favorable terms and pricing from them. If I'm the CFO, I'm getting the information I need, and we're having an impact on the organization, and it's helping us improve our profitability. That'd be my suggestion, is visualize what success looks like and then work that back into the process.
Appreciate that, Bob. I want to thank you and Andrew both for a very compelling presentation today. I'm sure a lot of additional questions out there, but I think we have the contact information available if you wanted to email us with any additional questions for Andrew, Bob, or myself. Or otherwise, one of the common questions we often get with the webinar is, can I get the content? You will receive an email follow-up within the next 24 to 48 hours that will include a copy of the slide deck for your proposal, and to share that information with your colleagues, as well as visit the Zycus website for an archive for this webinar to invite others of your colleagues to tune in as well. So thanks everyone for joining us today. Thanks Andrew and Bob for a great event, and have a great rest of the day.